The 41st Millennium does not announce itself gently. It announces itself with fire. The slipspace portal, if it could even be called that anymore, had collapsed behind him in a shriek of golden light and geometric fracture, leaving nothing but scorched rockcrete and the acrid smell of ozone where it had been. One moment John 117 had been standing on the bridge of a UNSC frigate, coordinates locked, Cortana's voice crisp in his ear. The next, he was here. Wherever here was. His HUD snapped to life instantly, Mjolnir's systems cycling through their startup diagnostics with practiced efficiency. Shields at 91%. Ammunition count nominal. Motion tracker active. Atmosphere. Breathable, though his filters flagged chemical particulates at hazardous concentration levels. He filed that away and moved. "Chief." Cortana's voice arrived fragmented, syllables clipping at the edges like a transmission cutting in and out through interference. Something is wrong with my... I can't. The local electromagnetic environment is unlike anything in UNSC databases. I'm getting readings that don't correspond to any known physics model. Are you intact? Partially, maybe 60%. There's something in the background radiation here. It's not cosmic. It's not solar. It's almost like... She paused, and Cortana never paused. It's like the interference has intention behind it. He didn't have time to process that, because the world around him was already explaining itself in the loudest possible language. He was on a bridge, a massive Gothic structure of blackened iron and stone stretching across a canyon choked with industrial smog, wide enough to land a pelican on. Towers rose on either side, carved with iconography he didn't recognize. Eagles with spread wings, skeletal figures in robes, a symbol that might have been a sun or might have been an eye, depending on how the firelight caught it. And there was plenty of firelight. The city beyond the bridge was burning, not the clean burning of a precision airstrike. This was consuming, structural, the kind of fire that meant a city was ending. The sounds hit him next. Weapons fire, energy-based, crackling and spitting, not the chemical propellant bark of a BR or the thump of a rocket launcher. Screaming that had gone mechanical, reduced to hoarse rhythm. And underneath it all, a low grinding that he identified 3 seconds later as something very large moving through rubble approximately 400 meters northeast. Then he saw the soldiers. They were dug in behind barricades of shattered stone and twisted metal about 60 meters ahead, wearing dull green flak armor that covered torso and shoulders but left arms and legs disturbingly exposed. Their weapons were unfamiliar, long rifles that fired coherent red beams rather than rounds, each discharge throwing a brief flash of heat he could read on his thermal sensors. There were perhaps 30 of them defending a barricade against something he couldn't yet see. They were going to lose. His tactical subroutines calculated it in under 2 seconds. Ammunition depletion rates, wound patterns among those still standing, the rate at which the barricade itself was being eroded by incoming fire. Maybe 8 minutes, maybe less. He moved toward them at combat speed. The first soldier who saw him dropped his weapon and stumbled backward, a sound escaping his throat that was equal parts prayer and animal fear. Several others spun, rifles snapping up, Master Chief raised one hand, not a surrender, just a pause, and kept walking until he reached the edge of their barricade and crouched beside it. "I'm not the enemy," he said. A woman with sergeant's insignia on her collar and blood tracking down the left side of her face stared at him. Her eyes swept his armor, the olive green Mjolnir plating, the gold visor, the sheer scale of him, and he watched her cycle through terror, confusion, and pragmatic desperation in roughly 4 seconds before she arrived at the only rational conclusion available to a soldier under fire. "Can you fight?" she asked. "Yes." She pointed northeast. "Then fight." He looked over the barricade. What he saw recalibrated several of his assumptions about the universe. They weren't human. Not quite. They were massive, green-skinned, heavily muscled creatures, wielding weapons that looked like they'd been assembled by someone who had heard a description of a gun, but never seen one. They bellowed as they charged, a wall of muscle and aggression and jagged metal, and they did not look afraid of anything. "Chief," Cortana said, her voice steadier now, sharpening with the analytical focus she defaulted to under stress. "I have no biological classification for these organisms, but their tactical behavior is consistent with a species that treats combat as a cultural imperative." I noticed. He stood up from behind the barricade, raised the MA5 across his chest, and the orcs noticed him for the first time. There was a brief pause in their charge, a single collective moment of recalibration, and then the largest one at the front raised its weapon and roared something that needed no translation. Master Chief fired first. "Welcome to the 41st Millennium, Spartan. If you're watching this story unfold and you want more cosmic collisions from beyond the void, smash that subscribe button. The Emperor protects those who bear witness to the Dark Millennium." The orcs did not break. That was the first thing that recalibrated his expectations. In his experience, a concentrated burst of accurate automatic fire into the front rank of a charging enemy created a psychological event: hesitation, fragmentation, the survival instinct asserting itself over aggression. It worked on Covenant infantry. It worked on brutes eventually. It had even worked, in limited circumstances, on flood-controlled husks that retained some vestigial combat programming. The orcs laughed. Not all of them. The ones his rounds actually punched through dropped with the appropriate finality. The MA5's 7.62mm rounds were doing real damage, tearing through the patchwork metal armor these creatures wore like it was suggestions rather than protection. But the ones adjacent to the falling bodies looked at their dead, looked at him, and accelerated. He adapted. Long range was a losing proposition against a target that didn't respect attrition. He vaulted the barricade. Behind him, he heard the sergeant shout something, an order, a warning, or possibly a prayer, and then the crack of those red beam rifles resuming fire over his head as her soldiers found new angles. Good. They were still functional, still fighting. He filed that away as a positive variable and closed the distance to the orc line at full sprint. The first one swung a cleaver the size of a small door. He ducked under it, drove his elbow into the creature's throat with enough force to collapse the strike, and used its falling bulk as a platform to launch himself into the second. But Mjolnir's strength amplification turned what would have been a powerful human punch into something that caved chest plates and sent a 400-pound organism skidding across rockcrete. He moved through them with the economy of someone who had been doing this since he was 14 years old. Not brutality for its own sake, but precision deployed at speed, targeting joints and throats and the angles where even thick alien physiology had to compensate. The orcs were strong, genuinely, surprisingly strong, stronger than brutes pound for pound, he estimated, and they hit with a recklessness that suggested pain was not a significant factor in their decision-making. One caught him across the pauldron with a spiked club, and his shields dropped 8% in a single impact. He noted that, adjusted his spacing, and kept moving. It took 4 minutes to break the charge, not because he killed all of them. He didn't. At some point, some calculus he didn't have access to shifted in the orc consciousness, and the remaining creatures pulled back into the smoke, still bellowing, still sounding more frustrated than afraid. Several of them were pointing at him and making sounds that his admittedly incomplete pattern recognition read as argument rather than retreat. He walked back to the barricade. The soldiers were staring at him, all of them. The wounded ones had stopped tending their injuries. The ones who had been firing had lowered their weapons. The sergeant stood at the center of it, her expression unreadable in the way of someone who had seen too much already and was now being asked to process one thing more. "What are you?" she asked, not hostile, genuinely asking. "Master Chief Petty Officer John 117, UNSC Navy." He paused, recognizing that none of those words would mean anything to her. "I'm a soldier, from somewhere else." "There is no somewhere else," one of the men behind her said. His voice carried the flat certainty of doctrine rather than geography. "There is the Imperium, and there is the Void." "Interesting theological framework," Cortana murmured privately. "Chief, I'm parsing their communication patterns. The linguistic base is recognizably human, derived from ancient Terran languages. These are humans. Baseline, mostly. With some augmentation in the sergeant, based on her neurological response times. That mattered. He hadn't been certain, beneath the armor and the grime and the exhaustion that had settled into all of them like a second skin. The sergeant's name was Valdez. She offered it without ceremony while her soldiers redistributed ammunition from the dead, and she pressed a cloth to the wound on her temple with the practiced indifference of someone who had stopped counting injuries years ago. To her regiment, what remained of it, which was less than a company now, had been holding this bridge for 11 days. The orcs had come from the Underhive. The reinforcements had not come from anywhere. "Command stopped responding on day 4, she said. "We assumed the Vox relay was destroyed. Now we assume command is destroyed." She said it the way someone states the weather, cold, factual, already integrated. He studied her. The discipline was real. Her soldiers were still maintaining their positions, still performing equipment checks, still functioning as a unit despite 11 days of attrition and abandonment. That was not nothing. That was, in fact, considerably more than nothing. "What's the objective?" he asked. She looked at him with something that might have been the first trace of dark humor he'd seen from her. Survive until someone notices we exist. Chief, Cortana said quietly, but I'm detecting an approaching aerial signature from the west. Large craft. Different energy signature from anything we've encountered so far. More refined. He turned west. Through the smoke and the burning skyline, something was descending. A gunship, angular and brutal in its architecture, painted black, bearing that same eagle iconography he'd seen carved into the bridge towers. It moved with authority, the kind of authority that didn't ask permission to land anywhere. Valdez saw it too. Her posture changed, and the change was not entirely relief. Inquisition, she said quietly. The word carried weight she didn't explain. Her soldiers heard it and straightened, but their eyes went careful in the way of people who have learned that scrutiny from above is not always safer than fire from ahead. The gunship touched down. Its ramp descended, and the figure who walked out wore black armor trimmed in red, carried a weapon that hummed with contained energy, and looked at Master Chief the way someone looks at a problem they have already decided requires solving. The Inquisitor's name was Marin Voss. She was not tall. She was not physically imposing in the way that the orcs had been, or the way that Master Chief simply was by default. But she walked across that bridge with the particular confidence of someone who had never once in their career needed to wonder whether the room would listen to them, and her eyes, pale gray, clinical, missing nothing, moved across the scene with the efficiency of a weapon scan. They settled on Master Chief and stayed there. Her retinue spread out behind her. 4 soldiers in black carapace armor with weapons already raised. A robed figure clutching a staff who hung back near the gunship with the careful positioning of someone who understood their own fragility. And a hulking augmented man whose left arm had been replaced from the shoulder down with something mechanical and brutal that ended in a rotating cutting implement rather than a hand. Voss stopped 10 feet from him. She did not look up at him the way most people did, the slight involuntary tilt that his height and armor tended to produce. She looked straight ahead, which meant she was looking at his chest plate, and she made it feel like eye contact anyway. "You are not Astartes," she said. Statement, not question. "No. Your armor bears no chapter markings, no imperial insignia, no Mechanicus Forge stamps." She clasped her hands behind her back. "Your weapons are non-standard. Your armor's energy signature does not correspond to any STC variant in Imperial records." A pause. "You arrived via an unregistered spatial anomaly during an active war zone." That's accurate. These are not reassuring facts. "She's good," Cortana observed privately. "She cataloged everything in under 30 seconds. Chief, I'm getting an energy reading from the robed figure near the gunship, something in the low-level psychic band. Different from the warp interference I've been filtering. More controlled. Be aware." He was already aware. He'd clocked the robed figure's positioning the moment the ramp came down, far enough back to be protected, close enough to be useful. Support asset. Possibly the most dangerous person in the group, depending on what controlled psychic energy meant in practical terms. "Where do you originate?" Voss asked. Somewhere that doesn't exist in your star charts." Everything exists in Imperial star charts. Then your star charts are incomplete. Something moved behind her eyes. Not anger, closer to the intellectual recalibration of someone filing new data against established framework. She turned briefly to Valdez, who was standing at attention with the rigid posture of someone trying very hard to be invisible. "Your report, Sergeant." Valdez gave it. Concise, accurate, a professional. She described his arrival, his engagement with the Orc advance, the tactical outcome. She used no embellishment and offered no interpretation. It was a good report. Master Chief noted that. Voss listened without interrupting. When Valdez finished, the Inquisitor was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet, the burning city continued its work around them, indifferent to the bureaucratic weight of the conversation happening on the bridge. "You fought the Greenskins without Imperial sanction," Voss said, returning to him. "You operate an unregistered powered armor system of unknown origin. You refuse to provide verifiable identification." She tilted her head slightly. "In my experience, there are two categories of beings who arrive unannounced in war zones wearing powered armor and refuse to explain themselves. The first category serves chaos. And the second? The second is more interesting, and considerably more dangerous." She studied him. "Which are you?" "She's not actually asking," Cortana said. "She's establishing a framework. Whatever you say next gets filed against a conclusion she's already working toward." He understood that. He'd been interrogated before, not often, and never successfully, but he understood the architecture of it. "I don't know what chaos is," he said. "I arrived here through a spatial anomaly I didn't initiate. I encountered soldiers under fire, and I helped them. That's the complete account. No one arrives anywhere without initiating something. Forerunner technology doesn't always require consent from the people it moves." That landed differently than he expected. Voss went very still. The specific stillness of someone who has just heard a word that matters. She glanced at the robed figure by the gunship, a brief exchange of looks that carried meaning he couldn't fully decode. Forerunner," she repeated carefully. "Chief, that word meant something to her," Cortana said, sharpening. "I don't know what, but her physiological response changed, elevated attention, possibly concern." "Does that mean something to you?" he asked. Voss didn't answer directly. Instead, she said, "You will accompany us. Your equipment will not be confiscated, yet. Your AI, if that is what the anomalous signal in your armor represents, will not be accessed, yet." She let both yets hang in the air with the weight of explicit threats that hadn't needed to be shouted. "This is not a request." "I know," he said. He fell in beside her retinue as they moved toward the gunship. As he passed Valdez, she met his visor with an expression he'd learned to read in soldiers across a dozen campaigns. The look of someone who wants to say, "Be careful," but has no framework in which that advice makes sense. He gave her a single nod. She straightened slightly and turned back to her line. "For what it's worth," Cortana said, as the gunship's ramp closed behind him, "I don't think she's going to kill you immediately." "That's a low bar." "We're working with low bars right now." The gunship lifted into the burning sky, and below them the bridge grew small, and Sergeant Valdez's ragged regiment grew smaller still. Tiny figures in dull green, holding a line nobody had come to relieve, in a war that seemed to have no memory of mercy. The gunship flew for 40 minutes before it landed. Master Chief spent those 40 minutes doing what he always did in situations where action wasn't immediately available. He observed, cataloged, and thought. The interior of the craft was utilitarian in the way of military vehicles across every culture he'd encountered, but the iconography was relentless. Skulls worked into every surface. Purity seals hanging from equipment racks like paper prayers. The eagle motif repeated on panels, weapons, and the armor of every soldier in the compartment. Whatever this Imperium was, it had decided that its identity needed to be stated constantly, as though forgetting it for a moment might cause everything to dissolve. Voss sat across from him and worked through a data slate, reading without looking up. Her augmented operative, she'd called him Kreutz once, without introduction, stood near the rear of the compartment and watched Master Chief with the patient attention of a weapon that had been pointed at something and told to wait. "I've been running analysis on everything I've recorded since arrival," Cortana said. Her voice was cleaner now, the fragmentation smoothing out incrementally as she adapted her filtering protocols to the warp's background interference. Not gone, but managed. "Chief, the scale of this civilization it's genuinely difficult to contextualize. The linguistic data alone suggests continuous human civilization spanning tens of thousands of years. The theological infrastructure is total. I mean that literally. Every system I can observe is built around a single religious framework. The Emperor. Every soldier I recorded mentioned him. Voss's retinue has the phrase worked into at least 4 separate pieces of equipment. It's not just culture. It functions like physics to these people, like gravity. He thought about that. He'd encountered religious conviction before. The Covenant had been built entirely on it, and that had cost humanity billions of lives and several worlds. But the Covenant's faith had been in something external, something they were trying to reach. This felt different. This felt like the faith was the load-bearing structure of the entire civilization, and if it cracked, nothing else would hold. The gunship landed on a platform attached to a vast fortress monastery carved into the side of a hive spire. One of the enormous towers he'd seen from the bridge, now close enough to register proper scale. The structure was genuinely immense, the kind of architecture that communicated power through sheer accumulated mass. Inside, the corridors were lit by torchlight supplemented by lumens, aligned with tapestries depicting battles that had apparently been ongoing for millennia, and staffed by people who stopped and stared at him with varying degrees of horror and religious awe. Voss led him to a chamber that was simultaneously an office and an interrogation room. The distinction between the two apparently not considered important. She sat. She did not offer him a seat. He stood, which was fine. He'd been standing through worse conversations than this. "Tell me about the Forerunners," she said. He gave her the relevant facts. Ancient civilization. Precursors in the truest sense. Technology so advanced it was still being discovered and misunderstood 100,000 years after their disappearance. the halo array, the portals. The fact that a fragment of their infrastructure had apparently punched him through whatever boundary separated his universe from hers. She listened with complete attention, the data slate forgotten in her hand. When he finished, she was quiet long enough that the torches in the wall sconces seemed loud by comparison. In imperial theology, she said finally, there are references to a race of beings who existed before humanity's ascension. Beings who shaped the galaxy and then vanished. The texts are fragmented, and most are classified at the highest levels of inquisitorial access. She paused. The parallels to what you describe are not comfortable. Chief, Cortana said, and her voice carried something he rarely heard from her, genuine unease. I've been running the warp interference data against everything I know about exotic physics, and I need to tell you something. Go ahead. The warp, whatever it actually is, it's not just radiation or spatial phenomenon. The interference it generates has recursive qualities. Self-referential. It responds to consciousness and emotion at a fundamental level. Another pause. In our universe, the flood represented the worst possible outcome of consciousness turned against itself. What I'm reading here suggests this universe has something analogous, but it's been running for longer, much longer, and it's not contained. He absorbed that without letting it show on his exterior. Containing existential threats was, functionally, his entire career history. The scale being larger didn't change the mathematics of the response. It just changed how long the response would take. You said the word Forerunner meant something to you, he said to Voss. She considered him for a long moment. The calculus behind her eyes was visible in a way she probably didn't intend. She was deciding how much truth was tactically useful in this conversation. 3 months ago, she said carefully, an installation was discovered in the Ghoul stars, ancient, geometric in its architecture, non-human in origin, but bearing no resemblance to any Xenos culture in Imperial records. She set the data slate down. It activated when our survey team entered it. It killed 4 of my best operatives and transmitted a signal of unknown content to an unknown destination. She looked at him steadily. The signal was transmitted 11 days ago, she said. You arrived 11 days ago. The torches flickered. Somewhere in the fortress, something structural groaned under its own ancient weight. Master Chief held the implication of what she'd just said and turned it over carefully, examining it from every angle. Someone, Cortana said quietly, wanted you here specifically. They gave him a cell that was more comfortable than it was trying to appear. It had a cot, which he didn't use. It had a door with 3 locks on the outside, which he noted without concern. Mjolnir's servo systems could handle all 3 in under 4 seconds if the situation required it. It had a small viewport that looked out over the Hive city's mid-levels, where the fires from the Orc siege had spread far enough to paint the perpetual smog orange. He spent 2 hours in that cell cataloging everything Cortana had gathered and trying to build a coherent operational picture from information that kept refusing to cohere. Then the Orc solved his immediate problem by breaching the fortress's eastern wall. The alarms, mechanical, clanging, deeply unsubtle, started at approximately 0300 by his internal clock. He heard weapons fire within 90 seconds, close enough to register on his motion tracker through the cell wall. He heard Voss's voice somewhere down the corridor giving rapid orders, and then the distinctive sound of her retinue moving at combat speed in the opposite direction from his cell. He waited 30 seconds to see if anyone was coming to release him. Nobody came. He handled the locks in 3.8 seconds and stepped into the corridor. The eastern breach was 2 levels down and 4 sections north. He triangulated it from the sound and moved toward it. Because the tactical reality was straightforward, an unsecured breach in a defensive position was a problem regardless of whose defensive position it was, and standing in a cell while it went unsecured was not something his conditioning allowed him to do comfortably. What he found when he arrived recalibrated his threat assessment considerably. The orcs that had breached this section weren't the disorganized advance wave he'd fought on the bridge. These were larger, better armed, and operating with something that approached coordination. A bigger creature at their center, easily twice the mass of the others, wearing armor that had been welded together from what appeared to be multiple vehicles, and carrying a weapon that fired explosive shells the size of his fist. The Imperial defenders in this corridor, a mix of Voss's black-armored soldiers and what appeared to be fortress garrison troops, were being pushed back steadily, the line compressing toward a choke point that wouldn't hold much longer. He pulled a grenade from his belt, assessed the geometry of the corridor, and threw it precisely into the gap between the large orc and its closest escort. The detonation bought him 3 seconds of chaos and the attention of every living thing in the corridor. He used the 3 seconds. The fighting that followed was close, brutal, and loud in the confined stone space. The orcs were stronger here than the ones on the bridge, better fed, better armed, the kind of specimens that had survived long enough in the Wa to accumulate genuine combat experience. The large one, he was already thinking of it as the war boss, the term assembling itself from context, took a full burst from his MA5 across its torso and kept moving, which was impressive in the way that only things you had to immediately solve were impressive. He dropped his rifle, stepped inside its swing radius, and drove the full weight of his armored fist into the joint where its neck met its shoulder with every newton of force Mjolnir's strength amplification could generate. The war boss went down. It did not get up. The remaining orc stopped. Not retreating, just stopped, in the sudden leaderless confusion of a force whose organizational principle had just been removed. The Imperial soldiers used the moment to reorganize their line, and Chief stepped back from the fallen war boss and let them do it. That was when the wall to his left exploded inward. Not from orc weaponry. The energy signature was different, sharper, more directed. Through the dust and shattered stone came 3 figures in green armor. Not Imperial green, a different shade entirely, sleeker and more elegant, moving with tactical precision that matched his own. They swept the corridor in under 4 seconds, weapons up, and then the lead figure's helmet tilted toward him and stopped. "Chief," Cortana said, suddenly alert. Their armor's communication systems are broadcasting on a frequency I can partially decode. It's a military channel. They're not orcs, not imperial. Their biological signatures read as human, but the armor tech is significantly more advanced than anything else I've seen here. "Who are you?" he asked the lead figure directly. A pause. Then a voice, female, precise, carrying the flat affect of someone trained to communicate efficiently under fire. "We could ask you the same question. Your armor doesn't match any imperial pattern. Your combat technique doesn't match any imperial doctrine." Another pause, shorter. "You just killed a war boss with your hands." He was in the way. Something in the figure's posture shifted. Not relaxation exactly, but a recalibration towards something less adversarial. She reached up and removed her helmet, it revealing a face that was sharp-featured, dark-eyed, and wearing an expression of cautious assessment. "My name is Liaison Commander Sarah of the Tau Expeditionary Contact Corps," she said. "We have been observing this fortress for 6 days. We came through the breach to retrieve something." Her eyes moved over him with the systematic attention of an intelligence professional. "We did not expect to find you." "Tau," Cortana said quietly. "Chief, these are Xenos, non-human civilization. But their technology level is sophisticated, and their communication patterns suggest a genuinely different philosophical framework from the Imperium." He looked at Sarah. She looked at him. Behind her, her team held their positions with the discipline of soldiers who trusted their commander to handle unexpected variables. "What were you retrieving?" he asked. She reached into a sealed case at her hip and withdrew a fragment of something, geometric, metallic, its surface covered in patterns he recognized immediately, despite the fact that he was approximately a universe away from anywhere he'd ever seen them before. Forerunner, unmistakably. "This," she said, "and whoever it summoned." The Tau extraction route was a maintenance tunnel running beneath the fortress's eastern foundation, narrow, low-ceilinged, and clearly surveyed in advance. Sarah's team moved through it with the confidence of people who had memorized every turn, which told him the 6 days of observation she'd mentioned had been considerably more active than passive. He followed. Not because he'd decided to trust them. Trust was a conclusion that required more data than he currently had. But because the alternative was returning to a cell, while an Inquisitor with an agenda and a theory about his arrival processed what to do with him. Forward motion in an uncertain situation was almost always preferable to stationary waiting. "I've been analyzing the Forerunner fragment she showed you," Cortana said as they moved. "The pattern density matches mid-period Forerunner indexing, the kind used in personnel and asset tracking systems. Chief, I think that fragment is part of a locator, something that was designed to find a specific individual and mark their position. They were looking for me specifically. Or for someone like you. Something the Forerunners cataloged and indexed at some point in the history of your universe, whose record somehow persisted into this one through whatever dimensional membrane the portal punched through." She paused. "I want to be honest with you. I'm working with significant gaps. My logic systems are still compensating for the warp interference, and about 30% of my analytical capacity is dedicated to just maintaining basic function. What I'm giving you is inference, a not certainty. Understood. Keep working. The tunnel opened into a basement level that connected to a series of collapsed underhive structures beyond the fortress perimeter. Sarah's team had a vehicle waiting, a sleek, hovering transport that moved on some form of anti-gravity suspension. Its design aesthetic entirely different from the brutal iron architecture of everything Imperial he'd seen. It was engineered rather than built, the distinction meaningful. Inside, once the transport was moving and the fortress had receded behind them, Sarah sat across from him and addressed him with the directness of someone who had decided that efficiency was more valuable than diplomatic preamble. "You are not from this universe," she said. "No." "The Forerunner fragment activated 11 days ago. Our monitoring systems detected the activation and triangulated the signal's destination point. This Hive World, this city, this specific district." She folded her hands on the table between them. "We arrived 4 days later. We have been waiting for whatever the signal summoned." "Why does the Tau Empire care about Forerunner technology?" "We care about everything that represents advancement beyond current limitations." She said it without apology or ideology, just fact. The greater good is not a static condition, it is a direction of travel. In technology that predates recorded history and operates on principles we don't yet understand, is precisely the kind of thing worth crossing a war zone for. "She's not wrong," Cortana observed. "From a pure research standpoint, Forerunner technology would be transformative for any civilization. The question is what they do with it." He studied Sarah. She was intelligent, composed, and operating with a clarity of purpose that he recognized from the best officers he'd served alongside. But purpose and trustworthiness weren't the same variable. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "Information, primarily. You clearly have familiarity with Forerunner technology that nobody in this universe possesses. That makes you uniquely valuable." She paused. "We can also offer you something in return." "Which is?" "A way home, potentially." She opened a second case on the table, this one containing a larger Forerunner fragment, more complete than the first, its surface actively cycling through dim geometric light patterns. "Our scientists believe this piece is part of a portal activation matrix. With your knowledge of how Forerunner systems operate and our technical capacity, reconstruction of the portal that brought you here may be achievable." He looked at the fragment. The light patterns were familiar, not identical to anything he'd worked with directly, but recognizable in the way that a word in a language you'd studied but not mastered was recognizable. "Chief," Cortana said carefully, "she might be telling the truth. The fragment's activation pattern is consistent with a transit matrix. I can't verify the claim about reconstruction without examining it properly, but it's not obviously false." The transport slowed. Through its narrow viewport, he could see they'd reached a staging area in the underhive, a hollowed industrial space where several more Tau soldiers waited alongside equipment that hummed with contained power. Then the transport's communication system activated with a harsh crackling that made Sarah's head snap toward it, and a voice came through that he recognized immediately. Voss. The signal was clearly being broadcast on a wide channel rather than a targeted one, a general transmission rather than a private contact. Her voice was precise and completely without inflection, which he'd already learned meant she was operating in her most dangerous register. To the entity currently in Tau custody, she said, "You will be aware that I know your location. You will be aware that I have the authority and the resources to reduce that location to ash within the hour." A pause. "You will also be aware that I have chosen not to do so, which means I am offering a conversation rather than an execution." Another pause, longer. "The offer has a time limit. It expires at dawn." Sarah was looking at him with an expression that had reorganized itself into something more complicated than the composed pragmatism she'd maintained until now. "She's been tracking us since you left the cell," she said. It wasn't an accusation, more the acknowledgement of a professional recognizing another professional's competence. "Probably since before I left the cell," he said. Sarah absorbed that. Then she said, carefully, "Whatever the Inquisitor offers you, understand that the Imperium does not make agreements. It makes temporary arrangements until it has sufficient force to make agreements unnecessary." He looked at the Forerunner fragment on the table, still cycling its quiet light. "Oz 2 offers," Cortana said. "One from people who might help you get home, and one from people who want to use you as a weapon. Neither one is actually about what you want. Has it ever been?" "No," she said. "But you usually at least get to choose which war you're fighting." Dawn was coming. The Hive city burned above them, indifferent to the choices being made in its basement. He contacted Voss at dawn. Not because her offer was better, he hadn't heard it yet. Not because he trusted the Imperium's intentions. Everything he'd observed suggested the Imperium's relationship with trust was strictly transactional. He contacted her because the Forerunner fragment on Sarah's table had shown him something in the night hours while the Tau scientists worked around it, something Cortana had flagged at 0400 with the careful tone she used when she had information that complicated everything. "The activation matrix isn't just a portal component," she'd said. "It's a beacon. It's been broadcasting since it activated 11 days ago. Not to the location you arrived from. To something else. Something in this universe. And whatever it's been broadcasting to has been broadcasting back." He'd asked her what was on the other end. She hadn't been able to tell him. Only that the return signal carried warp signatures dense enough to make her filtering systems work hard, and that it had been getting stronger every hour since arrival. That changed the calculus. A potential way home was valuable. A beacon actively attracting something from the warp was a threat that superseded personal extraction. It was the kind of variable he couldn't leave unaddressed, regardless of what it cost him. So he contacted Voss, and she arrived at the Underhive staging area 2 hours later with 6 black-armored soldiers, no heavy weapons visible, and the specific body language of someone who had decided to negotiate before eliminating, for now. Sarah's team positioned themselves with weapons holstered but accessible. The two groups occupied opposite ends of the industrial space like weather systems that hadn't decided whether to merge or collide, and Master Chief stood between them. Voss looked at the Forerunner fragments on the table. Her expression didn't change, but her eyes moved across them with an intensity that confirmed she'd known about them before walking in. "The Ghoul Stars installation," he said. "You've been trying to understand it for 3 months. Correct. You don't have anyone who can read the technology. Also correct. And you believe I can." She looked at him directly. "Can you?" "Partially, with time and with Cortana's analysis capacity. More completely." He paused. "But there's a more immediate problem than what I can or can't read." He told her about the beacon, the return signal, the warp signatures intensifying on the other end. He gave her the information plainly, without leverage or negotiation, because it was the kind of threat that required response regardless of whose side anyone was nominally on, and because watching her process, it told him things about her judgment he needed to know. She processed it in silence for approximately 15 seconds. Then she looked at Sarah. "Your scientists detected this also," she said. Not a question. Sarah's composure held, but barely. "We detected the outgoing signal. The return signal's nature became clear to us approximately 3 hours ago. And you said nothing. We were deciding how to respond." Voss's expression didn't shift toward anger. It shifted toward something colder and more considered. "In my experience," she said, "things that broadcast from the warp and grow stronger over time fall into a limited number of categories. None of them are categorized as acceptable." "She knows what it is," Cortana said privately. "Or she suspects. Chief, her physiological stress indicators spiked when you described the return signal's character. She's afraid of something specific." "What are we dealing with?" he asked Voss directly. She was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to feel like a decision being made. 3 months ago, when my operatives entered the Ghoul Stars installation," she said, "2 of them died immediately. The other 2 survived long enough to transmit a partial report before their Vox signals terminated." She reached into her coat and produced a data slate, setting it on the table between the Forerunner fragments. The report described the installation activating around them, described geometric patterns forming in the air, described voices, not audible, but perceived directly in the mind, speaking in a language they couldn't identify. She looked at him steadily. "The voices said one word that my operatives recognized, a name, repeated continuously until the transmission ended." She paused. "The name was not yours, but it was the name of something that predates the Imperium, something the oldest records describe as an architect, something that chaos cults across 6 sectors have been attempting to summon for 2 centuries. The industrial space felt colder than it had a moment before. "Chief," Cortana said, and her voice carried the specific quality it had when she was frightened and refusing to show it. "A Forerunner installation activating in a universe it doesn't belong in, broadcasting a summoning signal into the warp. That's not an accident. That's a mechanism. Something built that installation here, or modified it to function here, specifically to use Forerunner transit technology to pull something through from wherever it was contained. Something used me as a test," he said. "The portal that brought me here, it was a proof of concept." "Or a distraction," she said. something to occupy the Imperium's attention while the real transit charged. Voss and Sarah were both looking at him now, with the particular expression of people who had just understood that the situation was larger than anyone in the room had prepared for. "How long?" he asked Cortana. "Based on signal strength progression, maybe 36 hours before whatever is on the other end of that beacon has enough warp resonance to cross over." 36 hours. One threat. 3 parties who didn't trust each other, standing in a basement with the fate of something significant, resting on whether any of them could function together long enough to address it. He looked at Voss. He looked at Sarah. He picked up the larger Forerunner fragment from the table. "Then we need to start now," he said. Neither of them argued. The plan had 3 components and approximately 40% of the variables he preferred before committing to an operation. Component 1. Cortana would use the Forerunner fragments to trace the beacon's origin point and identify the installation's deactivation mechanism. Component 2. Voss would provide access to the Ghoul Star's installation data her operatives had transmitted before dying, along with whatever inquisitorial resources she could mobilize on a Hive World in the middle of an Orc siege, without triggering the kind of institutional attention that would complicate everything. Component 3. Sarah's technical team would work the fragments directly, their equipment more suited to delicate analytical work than anything the Imperium had available in this location. The arrangement required all 3 parties to share information they were instinctively reluctant to share. It was operationally a mess. It was also the only viable option, which was the category of situation Master Chief had spent most of his career navigating. They worked through the day in the Underhive staging area, while the Orc siege ground on above them, the distant percussion of it filtering down through layers of rockcrete and iron, like a reminder that the immediate problem existed inside a larger problem that wasn't pausing for anyone's convenience. Cortana made progress in increments, her analytical capacity improving as she developed better filtering protocols for the warp interference. By midday, she had mapped the beacon's transmission pattern well enough to identify its terminus point, not in the Ghoul Stars, not anywhere in the surrounding sectors, but directly beneath the Hive city, beneath the Underhive, beneath even the levels where Sarah's team had staged. "There's a secondary installation," he told the assembled group, "smaller than the Ghoul Stars site. It's been down here the entire time." Voss absorbed this with the expression of someone recalculating how badly they'd been outmaneuvered. "Beneath a Hive city with a population of 9 billion, she said. Positioned where any activation event would have maximum warp resonance from concentrated human consciousness and suffering. "Something planned this carefully," Sarah said. She wasn't asking. "Something with a very long timeline," Voss agreed. The 2 women exchanged a look that was the closest thing to genuine accord they'd managed since occupying the same space. They found the installation 4 hours later, 2 kilometers below the Underhive's lowest recorded level, accessible through a maintenance shaft that Cortana identified by cross-referencing the beacon's signal geometry with the Hive's structural blueprints, which Sarah's team had obtained during their 6 days of preparation, and Voss had obtained through inquisitorial access, the redundancy of their respective intelligences briefly useful rather than merely paranoid. The installation was small by Forerunner standards, a single chamber, perhaps 30 meters across, its walls covered in the dense geometric indexing patterns that Cortana had been learning to read since their arrival. At its center was a platform, and above the platform was a rift. Not a portal in the sense of the transit that had brought him here. This was something earlier in its cycle, a wound in the membrane between the warp and real space that pulsed with a slow rhythm, like something breathing on the other side. And standing at the platform's edge, working a console that should not have been functional, was a figure in robes the color of midnight with gold trim that caught the installation's ambient light in patterns that shifted too deliberately to be accidental. The Chaos Sorcerer turned when they entered. He was tall, unhurried, and wearing the expression of someone whose plan had arrived at the stage where the people trying to stop it walked through the door right on schedule. His eyes were wrong, not dramatically, not monstrously, just subtly, the irises cycling through colors in a sequence that didn't correspond to any biological mechanism. "The Spartan," he said, his voice carrying the warm interest of a collector examining a rare acquisition. I wondered which of my invitation's recipients would arrive first. His gaze moved to Voss. "Inquisitor, your persistence remains admirably tedious." Then to Sarah. "And the Tau, how pragmatic of you." "Chief," Cortana said, her voice tight, "the rift above that platform has accelerated. Signal strength just jumped 40%. Whatever's on the other side, it can feel that we're here." "You used the Forerunner installation in the Ghoul Stars," Master Chief said. "You modified it to broadcast into the warp. Modified is generous, redirected." The sorcerer stepped away from the console with the casual movement of someone who no longer needed it. "Forerunner transit technology is extraordinary, capable of moving matter across dimensional boundaries that even the warp cannot reliably bridge. With the appropriate modifications, it becomes capable of moving something considerably more significant than a misplaced Spartan." He smiled. "The entity I am retrieving has been contained in a pocket dimension for 11,000 years. The Forerunner installation created that containment. It seemed poetic to use Forerunner technology to undo it." "What did you summon?" Voss asked, her voice carrying the flat precision of someone who needed the answer confirmed rather than discovered. "Something that was here before your emperor drew his first breath," the sorcerer said. "Something that remembers when this galaxy belonged to minds worth respecting." He looked at Master Chief with genuine curiosity. "You arrived as a side effect. The transit matrix tested itself on you before committing to the primary extraction. I will admit I did not anticipate that you would become a complication rather than a distraction." The rift pulsed. The chamber shook. Somewhere on the other side of that wound in reality, something very old and very patient recognized that the door was almost open. "The console," Cortana said urgently. "Chief, if I can interface with it directly, not remotely, physically, I can attempt a shutdown sequence. But I need you at that console, and I need approximately 4 minutes, and I need everything between us and it to be handled. 4 minutes, 30 meters. One Chaos Sorcerer between them and the console, with the rift cycling faster above the platform, and Voss and Sarah positioned at the chamber's entrance with their respective teams and their respective weapons, and the shared understanding that what came through that rift would not distinguish between Imperial, Tau, or misplaced Spartan when it arrived. He looked at the sorcerer. The sorcerer looked at him with the patient interest of someone who had already run the numbers. "You cannot stop it," the sorcerer said simply. "The resonance is self-sustaining now. Even destroying the console only—" Chief was already moving. The sorcerer was fast. Not physically, his body moved at human speeds, slower than Chief's augmented reflexes by a significant margin. But the space between them stopped being reliable the moment Chief committed to the charge. Distance stretched. The floor's geometry shifted subtly, enough to redirect momentum without announcing itself as redirection. A step that should have covered 3 meters covered 1, and the sorcerer watched him compensate with the detached interest of someone observing an experiment proceed as predicted. Tzeentchian sorcery, Voss had called it during the transit down. The magic of change and manipulation. It didn't fight you directly. It altered the conditions under which you fought, rewrote the local rules of cause and effect until your trained responses became liabilities. He stopped trying to reach the sorcerer directly and change the problem. He pulled his last grenade, not to throw at the sorcerer. The spatial distortion would redirect it, but straight down at the floor beneath his own feet. The detonation launched him upward and forward at an angle the distortion field hadn't been calibrated to address, converting forward momentum into vertical and then diagonal, and he came down on the sorcerer's left side where the spatial manipulation was thinnest. The impact was solid, real. The sorcerer went down beneath 300 pounds of armored Spartan, and for a moment the distortion field collapsed entirely as his concentration broke. Voss moved in that moment. She was across the chamber in 4 seconds, her retinue flanking, and the weapon she carried, the one that hummed with contained energy, discharged twice in rapid succession, not at the sorcerer, at the rift. The shots hit the rift's membrane and the chamber screamed. Not metaphorically, the air itself vibrated at a frequency that registered on his audio filters as structural distress, and the rift's pulsing rhythm stuttered, lost its cadence, resumed faster and more erratically. "That destabilized it," Cortana said, and her voice was fracturing again, the warp interference spiking as the rift's activity increased. "Chief, shields, now!" He understood why a half-second before it happened. The rift discharged, a wave of warp energy that rolled outward from the platform like a pressure wave, visible as a distortion in the air, and it hit everything in the chamber simultaneously. Voss's retinue staggered. Sarah's team went down to their knees. The sorcerer beneath him convulsed and then laughed, the sound carrying genuine delight. His shields absorbed it, dropped to 31%, and held. He stood, grabbed the sorcerer by the collar of his robes, and looked at him with the specific quality of attention he reserved for conversations that needed to be brief and unambiguous. "The console shutdown sequence," he said. "Is it viable or not?" The sorcerer's wrong-colored eyes cycled through their shifting sequence. "You're asking me," you said, destroying the console only. And then I started moving. Finish the sentence. A pause. Then something shifted in the sorcerer's expression. Not cooperation, not fear, but the particular recalculation of someone who has just identified a variable they hadn't weighted correctly. "Destroying the console only accelerates the final transit," he said. "The shutdown requires a command sequence input from a Forerunner indexed individual." His eyes moved to Chief with an expression that was almost appreciation. "Which is why the installation summoned you specifically, You are indexed. You are recognized by the system. Another pause. I didn't account for the possibility that you would understand what that meant. Chief, Cortana said, her voice coming in fragments now, the fragmentation worse than it had been since the first hour of arrival. I need you at that console. The sequence, I can see it, but I need direct interface. The port on your left gauntlet. Use it. Cortana. He kept his voice level. How bad is the fragmentation right now? Bad enough that I'm going to lose. Some of me won't. Chief, just get to the console. Whatever I lose in the process, the shutdown matters more. He dropped the sorcerer, who made no move to rise, either unable or, strangely, unwilling, and crossed the chamber to the platform at a run. The rift above him was cycling at twice the speed it had been when they'd entered, its wound light casting everything in colors that didn't have names in any language he spoke. Through it dimly, he could see something on the other side, not clearly, not with definition, but with the specific quality of presence that preceded a very large thing arriving in a very small space. He found the interface port. It was Forerunner, geometric, recessed, nothing like a UNSC connection standard. But Mjolnir's left gauntlet had an adaptive interface architecture that Cortana had modified 17 times across their service together, and it found purchase on the third attempt. I have it, she said. I have, yes. The sequence is... Chief, this is going to feel strange. The installation responded to him. That was the only way to describe it. The geometric patterns on the walls shifted orientation, aligning toward him, and the console beneath his hand came fully alive with a light that was warm rather than cold, recognition rather than activation. The system knew him. Not him specifically. Knew the category of indexed individual he represented, the record the Forerunners had made of beings they had cataloged across whatever vast project had brought them to his universe. Initiating, Cortana said, and then, Chief, if this works, I want you to know that working with you has been... Don't. I was going to say adequate. A pause that felt like a smile. Initiating shutdown. The rift convulsed. The presence on the other side surged forward in the moment of closing. A final push, vast and ancient and genuinely furious. And the chamber shook with it, hard enough to bring stone dust from the ceiling and drop Voss's remaining soldiers to the floor. The sorcerer screamed, not in pain, in loss. The sound of someone watching a decade of work collapse in a single sequence. The rift closed, not gradually, not with ceremony. It simply stopped, and the chamber was dim and quiet and full of dust, and the platform was empty, and the terrible breathing rhythm that had underlain everything since they'd entered the room was gone. He stood at the console for a moment, his hand still interfaced, and waited for Cortana. Still here, she said finally. Her voice was quieter than before. Smaller. The sorcerer was fast. Not physically. His body moved at human speeds, slower than Chief's augmented reflexes by a significant margin. But the space between them stopped being reliable the moment Chief committed to the charge. Distance stretched. The floor's geometry shifted subtly, enough to redirect momentum without announcing itself as redirection. A step that should have covered 3 meters covered 1, and the sorcerer watched him compensate with the detached interest of someone observing an experiment proceed as predicted. Tzeentchian sorcery, Voss had called it during the transit down. The magic of change and manipulation. It didn't fight you directly. It altered the conditions under which you fought, rewrote the local rules of cause and effect until your trained responses became liabilities. He stopped trying to reach the sorcerer directly and change the problem. He pulled his last grenade, not to throw at the sorcerer. The spatial distortion would redirect it, but straight down at the floor beneath his own feet. The detonation launched him upward and forward at an angle the distortion field hadn't been calibrated to address, converting forward momentum into vertical and then diagonal, and he came down on the sorcerer's left side where the spatial manipulation was thinnest. The impact was solid, real. The sorcerer went down beneath 300 pounds of armored Spartan, and for a moment the distortion field collapsed entirely as his concentration broke. Voss moved in that moment. She was across the chamber in 4 seconds, her retinue flanking, and the weapon she carried, the one that hummed with contained energy, discharged twice in rapid succession. Not at the sorcerer, at the rift. The shots hit the rift's membrane, and the chamber screamed. Not metaphorically. The air itself vibrated at a frequency that registered on his audio filters as structural distress, and the rift's pulsing rhythm stuttered, lost its cadence, resumed faster and more erratically. That destabilized it, Cortana said, and her voice was fracturing again, the warp interference spiking as the rift's activity increased. "Chief, shields, now." He understood why a half-second before it happened. The rift discharged, a wave of warp energy that rolled outward from the platform like a pressure wave, visible as a distortion in the air, and it hit everything in the chamber simultaneously. Voss's retinue staggered. Sarah's team went down to their knees. The sorcerer beneath him convulsed and then laughed, the sound carrying genuine delight. His shields absorbed it, dropped to 31%, and held. He stood, grabbed the sorcerer by the collar of his robes, and looked at him with the specific quality of attention he reserved for conversation that needed to be brief and unambiguous. "The console shutdown sequence," he said. "Is it viable or not?" The sorcerer's wrong-colored eyes cycled through their shifting sequence. "You're asking me? You said destroying the console only, and then I started moving. Finish the sentence." A pause. Then something shifted in the sorcerer's expression. Not cooperation, not fear, but the particular recalculation of someone who has just identified a variable they hadn't weighted correctly. "Destroying the console only accelerates the final transit," he said. "The shutdown requires a command sequence input from a Forerunner indexed individual." His eyes moved to Chief with an expression that was almost appreciation. "Which is why the installation summoned you specifically. You are indexed. You are recognized by the system." Another pause. "I didn't account for the possibility that you would understand what that meant." "Chief," Cortana said, her voice coming in fragments now, the fragmentation worse than it had been since the first hour of arrival. I need you at that console. The sequence, I can see it, but I need direct interface. The port on your left gauntlet. Use it." "Cortana," he kept his voice level. "How bad is the fragmentation right now?" "Bad enough that I'm going to lose. Some of me won't. Chief, just get to the console. Whatever I lose in the process, the shutdown matters more." He dropped the sorcerer, who made no move to rise, either unable or, strangely, unwilling, and crossed the chamber to the platform at a run. The rift above him was cycling at twice the speed it had been when they'd entered, its wound light casting everything in colors that didn't have names in any language he spoke. Through it, dimly, he could see something on the other side. Not clearly, not with definition, but with the specific quality of presence that preceded a very large thing arriving in a very small space. He found the interface port. It was Forerunner, geometric, recessed, nothing like a UNSC connection standard. But Mjolnir's left gauntlet had an adaptive interface architecture that Cortana had modified 17 times across their service together, and it found purchase on the third attempt. "I have it," she said. "I have, yes, the sequence is, Chief, this is going to feel strange." The installation responded to him. That was the only way to describe it. The geometric patterns on the walls shifted orientation, aligning toward him, and the console beneath his hand came fully alive with a light that was warm rather than cold, recognition rather than activation. The system knew him, not him specifically, knew the category of indexed individual he represented, the record the Forerunners had made of beings they had cataloged across whatever vast project had brought them to his universe. "Initiating," Cortana said, and then, "Chief, if this works, I want you to know that working with you has been, don't. I was going to say adequate," a pause that felt like a smile. Initiating shut down. The rift convulsed. The presence on the other side surged forward in the moment of closing. A final push, vast and ancient and genuinely furious, and the chamber shook with it hard enough to bring stone dust from the ceiling and drop Voss's remaining soldiers to the floor. The sorcerer screamed, not in pain, in loss, the sound of someone watching a decade of work collapse in a single sequence. The rift closed, not gradually, not with ceremony. It simply stopped, and the chamber was dim and quiet and full of dust, and the platform was empty, and the terrible breathing rhythm that had underlain everything since they'd entered the room was gone. He stood at the console for a moment, his hand still interfaced, and waited for Cortana. "Still here," she said finally. Her voice was quieter than before, smaller. Something had been lost. He could hear the absence of it in her cadence, the way a voice sounds when it's working around a gap. "Not all of me, but enough." "Enough is sufficient," he said. Behind him, Voss was already issuing orders to her surviving retinue. Sarah was helping her own people to their feet, her composure restored with the speed of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of aftermath. The sorcerer sat against the chamber wall with the hollow expression of a man whose purpose had just been removed from him and made no move toward anything. The installation's light faded gradually, the geometric patterns on the walls returning to their dormant configuration. The Forerunner technology, its indexed task completed, went quiet. Master Chief removed his hand from the console and turned to face what remained. The aftermath of catastrophe has its own specific silence. It isn't peaceful. It's the silence of systems that have been running at maximum capacity, suddenly finding nothing left to push against. The quiet of people who have been operating on crisis momentum, discovering that the crisis has resolved, and they must now decide what they are to each other without the organizing principle of immediate threat. Voss broke it first, because Voss was the kind of person who treated silence as a resource to be managed rather than experienced. The installation needs to be destroyed, she said. Completely. Nothing the Inquisition cannot account for can be permitted to remain functional beneath a hive city of 9 billion. Agreed, Sarah said. She said it without hesitation, which earned a fractional reassessment from Voss that both women pretended hadn't happened. The sorcerer was taken into inquisitorial custody without significant drama. He offered no resistance. The hollowness in his expression had deepened into something that looked less like defeat and more like a man who had organized his entire existence around a singular purpose and was now confronting the architecture of a life with its load-bearing wall removed. Master Chief watched them lead him out and thought about what it meant to be defined entirely by a mission, and whether the sorcerer's condition was as foreign to him as it should have been. "You're thinking about it," Cortana said quietly. "About what?" "Whether you're the same, mission-defined. What happens to you if there's no war to fight?" "There's always a war to fight." "Chief." Her voice carried the specific gentleness she deployed rarely and with precision. "We might not get home." He was quiet for a moment. Around them, Sarah's technical team carefully documented the installation before beginning its systematic dismantlement, their movements professional and unhurried. Voss stood at the chamber entrance, coordinating her retinue via Vox, her back partially turned, giving him space, he realized, which was a more human gesture than he'd expected from her. "I know," he said. And he looked at the dormant console, at the installation's quiet walls, at the chamber where something very old had almost broken through from wherever it had been kept, and hadn't, because a collection of people who had no particular reason to trust each other had managed to function together for long enough to prevent it. "And we handle what's in front of us," he said. "Same as always." Cortana was quiet for a moment. Then, "The portal matrix fragments. Sarah still has them. The reconstruction theory isn't dead. It would take time, resources, and significantly more of my analytical capacity than I currently have." A pause. "But it's not impossible." He picked up that word and examined it. Not impossible. In his experience, not impossible and achievable were separated by enormous distances of blood and time and cost, but they were connected by a direction of travel, and direction of travel was enough to operate on. He crossed the chamber to where Sarah was supervising her team's work. She turned when she heard him approach, and her expression carried the particular quality of someone who had already anticipated this conversation and prepared for it honestly. "The portal matrix," he said. "Still intact," she confirmed. "Our offer remains open. Research partnership, shared findings, and genuine effort toward reconstruction." She paused. "I won't pretend the Tau Empire's interest is purely altruistic, but I will tell you that our interest in returning you to your own universe is sincere. A being with your knowledge and your index status is considerably more valuable as a known quantity than as a permanent variable in a universe that doesn't know what to do with you." It was, he reflected, one of the more honest assessments of his situation he'd received since arriving. "I'll need time with the fragments," he said, "and resources." "We anticipated that." Voss appeared at his shoulder with the silent arrival of someone who had never learned to make noise when moving wasn't tactically necessary. "The Inquisition also has resources," she said, "and considerably more access to this sector than a Tau expeditionary unit." She looked at Sarah. A temporary arrangement, defined scope, no institutional entanglement beyond the immediate objective. Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Defined scope, she agreed. Did the Inquisition and the Tau Empire just agree to cooperate? Cortana said privately. Because of us? Apparently. I'm filing that under things I never expected to see. Right next to Chief defeats a war boss with one punch, and Forerunner technology works in a universe it shouldn't exist in. He almost smiled. It was the closest he'd come since arrival. They emerged from the installation into the Underhive's perpetual artificial dusk, the distant sounds of the orc siege providing their familiar backdrop. Diminished now, the wah losing cohesion without the war boss he'd killed on the bridge to sustain its organizational momentum. Voss had already dispatched forces to exploit that weakness. The Hive City would survive. This time. He stood at the threshold between the installation's darkness and the Underhive's gray light and took stock. Cortana was diminished but present, adapting, rebuilding what she could from what remained. Mjolnir was functional, shields recharging steadily. He was alive and operational in a universe that had tried several times in rapid succession to make him otherwise, and had not succeeded. Sergeant Valdez was up there somewhere, still holding her bridge with her ragged regiment, still doing the work of survival with the patient discipline of someone who had never been given a better option. He thought he'd check on that. "Chief," Cortana said as he moved toward the elevator shaft that led back to the inhabited levels. "For what it's worth, I think we're going to be all right." "We always are," he said. "You say that with remarkable consistency for someone who keeps ending up in impossible situations." Someone has to. Above them, the Hive City burned and endured in equal measure, 9 billion lives pressing on through the grinding darkness of the 41st Millennium, with the particular stubbornness of a species that had survived everything the universe had ever aimed at it. Master Chief understood that stubbornness in his bones. He'd been built from it. He stepped into the elevator and rode it upward toward the light and the noise and the work that remained. He did not find a way home quickly. He hadn't expected to. The portal matrix reconstruction became a project measured in months. Careful, incremental work conducted in the uncomfortable overlap between inquisitorial resources and Tau technical capacity, supervised by an Inquisitor who trusted no one, and a liaison commander who trusted everyone provisionally, and both of whom, over time, developed something that wasn't quite respect for each other, but functioned similarly under pressure. Cortana rebuilt herself slowly. Not completely. Some of what she'd lost in the shutdown sequence didn't return, and she adapted around the gaps with the pragmatic resilience that had always defined her. She was different afterward. Quieter in some registers, sharper in others. She didn't discuss it directly, and neither did he. Sergeant Valdez's regiment was reinforced 12 days after the installation's destruction. The orc wah broken by a combination of Imperial counteroffensive and the leadership vacuum chief had created on the bridge. Valdez was promoted. She sent a brief Vox message that reached him through channels he suspected Voss had facilitated without acknowledging. Still alive. Figure you had something to do with that. He did not become an Imperial weapon. He did not become a Tau asset. He remained what he had always been, a soldier operating on his own judgment, in service of outcomes he chose, accountable to a code that had survived every universe it had ever been tested in. The 41st Millennium did not break him. It tried in the ways it tries everything, with scale and darkness and the grinding pressure of a reality that treats hope as a tactical weakness. He answered it the way he answered everything. He kept moving. Somewhere in the ghoul stars, a dormant Forerunner installation waited. Somewhere beyond it, a portal home was theoretically possible, not impossible. That was enough. The Emperor protects. More stories await.